Welcome everyone to TIS Talks, Transformative Impact Summit Talks. This is a follow-up series that we're doing to Transformative Impact Summit, which we ran in December online. We are running again in September in person in New York at the end of Climate Week. We have a really wonderful team, and specifically a great producer on board. Some folks might know Jamaica Stevens. Very excited to be having her steward what is sure to be a great event. Joe was one of the keynotes, and for everyone who knows Joe, is a real hero for humanity and the earth. He's done some brilliant work, which we're going to get into, and of late has been sharing some very important perspectives that to a few of us really feel not just resonant but important and maybe the way. And so before we get in, I just wanted to give some context and talk actually about the why today is so important, or what Joe's talking about is so important. So Transformative Impact Summit is an event that brings change makers together to feature their work, break down the silos between them, and connect them not only with each other, but ideally with funders and the public, and really make the public more aware of the impact of what they're doing and the importance of what they're doing. And so we had 12 different impact tracks, from regenerative agriculture, food systems and soil, to change in Africa, business as vehicle for change, Web3 and tech for good, etc. And for each track, we basically had a keynote, and Joe was effectively the keynote, even though because of timing he was on the last day. He was effectively the keynote for the regenerative ag and food systems and soil track. But the first keynote that we had of the event was Forrest Landry, who's a philosopher. And last month, where we did this kind of session with Forrest, we did an overview of what he spoke about in his keynote. And we talked about why would we have a philosopher be the keynote for a change maker event? And it was really because if we're going to climb high on the ladder, we really want to make sure it's leaning against the right wall. And Forrest's big picture, the main theme from what he spoke to, was that metaphysics asks three things: what is, how do we know, and what do we value? And what is, in his framing, is nature, and the way of nature is change. And our way to survive and adapt to nature is through flow or adaptability. How do we know? There are many ways of knowing. There's embodied knowing, internal introspection. There's knowing in relationship and in community. And then for most of the Western world, it's through science and logic and rationality, which leads to our use of technology. And our use of technology with the birth of the Industrial Revolution allowed us to transcend change through causing change, causation. And causation for the last few hundred years has been the force that we've imposed our will with on the world. And we're today with climate change and environmental degradation and inequality, we're seeing the limits of causation. And so Forrest's point was that we must now transcend causation. How? Through choice. What do we value? Well, that's our ethics, and that's expressed through our behaviors, which are a function of our choices. And it's not just our individual choices, but our collective choices. And so the main takeaway was that we have to get better at making wise choices together. The question is, what do we make choices about? And Joe brings what feels like a very refreshing and sobering and important framing into what is necessary for us to focus on. And many of us in the room are in the kind of impact or systems change or social change space in some way. And so I can speak for myself, last few years, I've got to meet so many inspiring change makers and see so many amazing projects. But, and so I don't say this lightly, but what Joe speaks to, and others who kind of emphasize the need for this awareness of bioregionalism, is it really feels to me personally like the way. And so wanted, with Forrest being the first TIS Talks speaker to help kind of reinforce that framing. I really wanted Joe to be the first kind of practical conversation we have about specifically what are we going to do together to ensure a thriving future for humanity and for the earth itself. So first I want to warmly welcome Joe and Penny, who's probably behind somewhere off screen. Hello. So just for context, Joe and Joe can fill in gaps for sure. Joe has a background in earth sciences and cultural design. The language I'm totally off, but understanding group dynamics on a social level, understanding the earth science, and has spent long time with his hands in the dirt in the beautiful earth, actually regenerating the earth. I'll just ask for anyone who's not speaking if you could mute yourself. And Joe was recently in Toronto, where I reside, and was speaking, thanks to some folks there that brought him in, was speaking on the importance of bioregional consciousness and governance and coalitions. And so wanted to both invite Joe to kind of give any framing he wants to today as well. One of the practices we initiated last time was this vision that Forrest had for communicating some of his ideas through having someone else synthesize them with him in the room to adjust. So I think that's an important practice for a number of reasons, not the least of which is, wouldn't it be wonderful if we all learned what, for example, Joe is teaching, and we learned to put it in our own words and be able to communicate it ourselves to others. So today will be a bit of a mix between trying to synthesize in our words what he's speaking to, with him here to fill in the gaps for anything we're missing, and hopefully some time for discussion as well. But before we dive in, Joe, wanted to warmly welcome you and invite you to share any framings that feel alive.
Thank you, Elliot. And I see several friends here, and hopefully several new friends by the time we're done today. So maybe let me just start by saying that one of my big preoccupations since about the age of 3 was, why is it that people seem to be so mean to each other? I grew up on a farm in the country and an industrial chicken farm in Missouri in the middle of the United States. A lot of meth addiction and domestic violence and broken homes and just, I would say, background social violence that I grew up with. And so that later evolved into, why are we so, why can we be so mean to rivers? Why can we be so mean to, the planetary climate system or the Earth's biosphere? And so in that 3-year-old kid sort of way of being on the playground and wondering why the kids were mean to each other, I think I want to start today by saying that one of the big questions that's guided everything I do is to ask, what does it really mean to be human? And then, what does it mean to be human right now in this moment of what is truly a cosmological event, which is that we're in a moment where a specific species on a very rare planet, a planet that holds complex life, possibly the only planet that holds complex life, we don't know. We haven't even found simple prokaryotic life on other planets yet, although there's good reason to believe there are probably a lot of prokaryotic planets, probably very, very few multicellular planets, for reasons we could talk about in the realm of astrobiology for anyone who wants to. But here we are on a planet that's 4.56 billion years old, with 3.6 to 3.8 billion years of continuous history of life, with the first time in the history of the planet that a single species is destabilizing the entire planet. There is one previous time where a category of species, the cyanobacterias, released a whole bunch of oxygen into the atmosphere and caused a mass extinction event. but it wasn't a single species. Here we are with a single species causing a mass extinction event, which could well take us the way of the dodo, meaning causing humans to go extinct. And we're in this moment with a lot of details we can say about what's happening to the planet. And I'll just save the litany. I don't think I need to go into the full range of the challenges we're facing, but to say that the main cause of the destabilization of our planet is the cumulative cultural evolution of human behaviors in a way that creates exponential change, enabling us to scale more rapidly than non-human systems can cope. And every living system that does this leads to collapse. We are in the midst of that now, in an overshoot and collapse moment of a planetary scale. And in this moment, there's a really important need to get at the root causes, to understand what's really going on. And then from this place of understanding what's really going on, see what is most powerful to do. And it turns out that one of the most powerful things to do is to recognize that humans are a part of the earth, that this cultural evolution process is a natural, organic, biological process of a living organism of the planet, and that unlike many other organisms that exhibit cultural evolution, we can practice conscious or intentional or guided or planned or designed, or pick your word. You can see each word has its own strengths and weaknesses. But as one of my mentors in the realm of cultural evolution, David Sloan Wilson, he likes to say, we need to become wise managers of our own evolutionary process. And he's an evolutionary biologist. And I think we need to become wise managers of our own evolutionary process, which means, one, we need to understand evolution. Two, we need to understand human evolution. Three, we need to understand human cultural evolution, because we have this thing called dual inheritance or gene culture coevolution, that biological evolution and cultural evolution feed each other in really powerful ways. It's very complex and very interesting. And that we're in a moment where we have to become wise managers of, unfortunately, of planetary evolution. Because humans have become, as I read once in this geophysical research letters, a research paper from 1999, humans as a geomorphic agent, where they found that humans move more soil than natural erosion processes because of human management of land. So for more than 20 years, humans have been moving more earth than earth, at least on continents. So humans as a geomorphic agent means humans are now an earth system process. And so the work that I do is about trying to help people understand how human beings can become regenerators of the earth, which means how we can guide the living systems that we are a part of toward health, well-being, and flourishing at the appropriate scales. And it's in that exploration that this topic of bioregionalism comes up. And so maybe I'll stop before going into bioregionalism, because that was a broad and sweeping introduction. But maybe let me summarize it and pass it back to Elliot to take us to the next step, which is to say, humans have now become a planetary force of change. If we're talking about Earth systems or systems of the dynamic Earth, human cultural evolution needs to be seen as a system of the Earth, which we may not have said 100,000 years ago or 1,000,000 years ago. We definitely would have said 50 years ago, and yesterday and tomorrow. And that this cultural evolution process needs to be understood and guided toward holistic health at every scale, all the way up to the planet. And that bioregions pop out of this as a very powerful holistic scale for doing the work, which we can talk about in a moment. But Elliot, is this a good starting point for us, and how would you nudge us forward?
Yeah, beautiful. Just understanding I guess, the scope of our impact and presence in the evolving or unfolding of Earth's evolution, that's a really powerful framing, that we are one of the great forces now impacting that. And that speaks back to that idea of, thus, our capacity to make wise choices becomes very important, but wise choices relative to what context. And that's where understanding what we mean by bioregionalism and um, how we play a part both collectively and individually, or at least locally, in that. And I think one of the things, the way you're describing it, and if we do somewhat, so to speak, wake up to this awareness that we together are a great force on the earth, it's almost like another pale blue dot moment where we can kind of wake up to a recognition of our tetheredness to each other. And that actually brings me back. Another of the keynotes from the event was Rupert Reed, who was one of the co-founders of Extinction Rebellion, but he wrote a book called Parents for a Future. And what's interesting, what struck me about that book, or even just the title, was the idea that, you know, especially in today's very divided world where people are either choose to or funneled into different groups or tribes, one the interesting thing about parents as a group is it transcends all divisions of class and race and gender. And but you know, and I actually would argue that we're all parents, even if we're not parents, but some don't identify as parents. But what's interesting about bioregionalism as a framing is it goes even further for uniting us all, because no matter who we are or where we are somewhere. And that where has an impact on the broader ecosystem and is impacted by the broader ecosystem. And that there was a point from some of you, as I was reviewing for today, some of your previous talks, there's a really important point. You know, many of us, so I'm right now in Costa Rica in this beautiful community of change makers that are set up on a land project. But previously I was on a farm a few hours from here, where, you know, to meet folks that are dedicating their lives to the earth was really wonderful. And to see people that are, you know, tilling the soil, putting their hands in the earth and growing food together is wonderful. And so there's this natural thought when one experiences that, oh, that's all we need. We just need lots of these little land projects. But one of the things from your talk was the recognition that will inevitably be insufficient, because these land projects, no matter how regenerative they are, no matter how big they are, no matter how impactful they are, they're part of a larger ecosystem. That those plots of land are part of a larger ecological connection. And if an amazing project is in a watershed that dries up, it doesn't matter how great that project was, it was not sustainable, because it did not address the ecosystem outside of itself. And there are these holons, these kind of nested groupings that you speak to, from plots of land to ecological connection to holistic landscapes, to the planet as a whole. And so I'd love both your reflection on whether that is like the right framing to bring in at the outset, and what else you would add to that. But for me, that felt so important, because many of us feel, okay, all we need to do is green a little more, or be a little more caring with the earth, and that'll be sufficient. It's not, unless it is, in the end, I think your point, a planetary network that is conscious of each node being conscious of the larger ecosystem within which it sits. We're going to fail, because we are an interconnected whole, not just isolated plots of regenerative projects.
Yeah, I would say that maybe to begin, to start extending that and bring some real groundedness to it, is that like if you're on a piece of land, like say you have 20 acres of reforestation work, or something that's restoring water, restoring soil, restoring biodiversity, and all doing wonderful things, it's always connected to another place, which could be the movement of air that brings in the moisture. It could be the movement of birds that carry seeds. It could be the flow of water across the land, where contaminants enter above and then flow across and below. But there's always this embeddedness and connection. And so one of the questions becomes, how do we understand what the whole system is? What is the whole system? And this is where the word bioregion becomes really interesting as a starting point. Because if we look at bioregionalism as a movement, It's associated with going back to the land in the 1960s. There are these, founding writers and thinkers like Gary Snyder and Peter Berg, and those who were doing this thinking in the 60s and 70s, the first bioregional congresses in the 70s and 80s. And so we have this sense of it being almost like a political movement, like a rebellion against civilization and so on. And that's not incorrect, but it's not helpful, because it can have us easily fall into thinking that it's another political philosophy. And what I would say is there's actually a more foundational basis from which political philosophy can be constructed, which is that the word bioregion, literally, bioregion is short for biological region. It's two words, biological region. And so biological region is simply the geography or the entire life context for a population of a species. And so the example I like to give is starfish. The starfish live in the intertidal zones of coastal estuaries or coastal regions, the high tide to low tide mark with tide pools, and with maybe they have like a coastal reef system or what have you. But the geography or the biological region is defined as a physical space. It is the intertidal zone for the starfish. So a biological region, which maps onto a related concept, biogeography. Biogeography is looking at spatial patterns of evolution. So just to briefly name that, biogeography was started by Alexander von Humboldt when he came from Germany to Colombia and started going around the northern Andes, where there are these really tall mountains with parallel, narrow, and deep channels of water, which means as you go up and down the Andes and as you go from one drainage to the next, you get different evolutionary pathways. You get different kinds of frogs, different kinds of trees, and you end up with a geography of evolution. So biogeography is the recognition that landscapes shape the kind of evolution that can occur. So you can have a geography of evolutionary processes, a tropical rainforest system, a cloud forest system, a tropical dry forest system. These are geographies of evolutionary patterns that converge as ecotypes. So the insight is that biological regions are geography and evolution for the whole life system of organisms and of ecosystems. And so this sort of scientific biological basis, rather than a philosophical, a political philosophy basis, is helpful to thinking about bioregions. Because then we can ask, what is the biological region, or what is the geographic range, the physical geography, if you will, for a healthy and sustainable human system? Turns out we have lots of examples because they're called indigenous cultures. That there are landscape patterns of holistic and healthy human cultures that have withstood the test of time for thousands of years, sometimes as semi-nomadic patterns. Like I know Benjamin Life, who's here on the call, living in the Front Range of Colorado, where the Ute people would go up into the mountains in the summer and go down into the plains during the winter, and they had a nomadic pattern across the landscape. Whereas others, like a tropical rainforest culture in the Amazon, might be a specific little branch of a river with a huge complexity of biodiversity and might have a very small geography. And so the idea is that bioregions are the whole life context of the organism and everything they need for their survival. All the material flows of food, for shelter, in human cases, technology and clothing, but also reproduction and reproductive success. So you think just in general biological terms. So when we think in this way, a bioregion is the only scale at which sustainability can occur, because the bioregion is the scale of the whole life system of the species or the organism. It's like all of the tree frogs in a particular region have a bioregion. All of the human culture of a place have a bioregion. And then it moves from being a political philosophy to an ecological reality. So the ecological reality is a bioregion is the scale at which you define sustainability for a population. And so when we think in this way, we start to see that human culture has a biological component, but it also has a cultural component, which means the ecology and the geology of the place are really important, but so is the cultural identity and the social organization of the culture. So you might have the same landscape with its same range of ecology, a different mode of social organization or a different kind of technology, like spear users versus bow and arrow, like you have different technology, change the social organization, and that would augment or alter the bioregion. So human bioregions have this added complexity of being adaptive to landscapes with changes in organization and with technology, but still they define the whole unit of a sustainable human culture. And so bioregionalism becomes a foundational focus for whole system design for human cultures by the definition of bioregions. And so I wanted to start there because that allows us to see, like, you have that reforestation project or that regenerative farm. Why is it that it cannot create a sustainable culture? Well, because the material flows, which are in the human system, are subsets of the material flows of the larger ecosystem. And if the material flows of the human system are not in harmony with that larger nested whole, then they're not sustainable. Pretty much that's the definition of sustainability, is that it stays within harmony of the regenerative capacities of the ecosystem it's embedded in, and that scale achieves self-organization as a bioregion. So when we think this way, we see that bioregions are a necessary place that we arrive to by understanding the self-organizing patterns of living systems as part of landscapes, which, by the way, can be oceanic landscapes like the starfish, which is an aquatic environment in a coastal estuary. So you could ask, what is the bioregion of migratory whale species? They have these huge bioregions. Like the blue whale that travels 4,000 miles, its bioregion is its movement pattern, which might be an ocean current or an ocean mixing process, might define the characteristic scale of the bioregion for the blue whale. And so this way of thinking makes concrete, makes clear, and if need be, mechanistic. When it's necessary to have cause-effect mechanisms to understand how things work, there are cause-effect mechanisms in biology and in ecology, and of course in economy. So human economies need to be integrated in this way. So that's maybe where I would start helping make bioregionalism more concrete as a way of getting to the holism of human sustainability, is that any sustainable human culture will be a bioregion, just by, in the tautological way that it's defined, that the whole life context is sustainable, which means the bioregion is the sustainable unit because of how bioregion is defined. And so when we think in this way, then we look at those early thinkers of bioregionalism, where they ask questions like Peter Berg did. He was the founder of the Planet Drum Foundation in San Francisco. He asked, what is the tectonic plate that gave rise to the watershed that brings the water to where I live, that is the landscape life system that enables me to live in San Francisco Bay? And he learned to recognize the different levels of the earth, the functional relationships of the different levels of the earth that create those ecological functions of survivability that tell someone how to live in the place they are. And to live in San Francisco is very different than living where I live in Columbia. So it's unique to place. Each place has its own layers of geology and geomorphology, or land forming, like the movement of water to create a watershed, migratory patterns and ecological diversity, functional types of niches and habitats. All these things become elements on the palette of design for a human culture. And so that's why the bioregional scale is so important. But then what we begin to realize is each bioregion is nested within larger continental scale and Earth system scale processes. So now let's take San Francisco in another way. Where does all the water come from for San Francisco? Well, it's connected to the El Nino La Nina, which is a coupling of ocean mixing processes for temperature together with the jet stream, which is a planetary scale dynamic of the climate system, together with weather patterns of land-sea interactions, and you start to see there are nested scales of connection. And so when we're in a place where we have destabilized or degraded the health and resilience of these kinds of connections, so not right now, El Nino and La Nina is chaotic, which means it's unpredictable when there will be droughts, which, as we saw in California, massive droughts followed by massive floods. And then you can't have stable agriculture. that those larger systems affect the bioregions. So we must design for bioregional scale and recognize the interdependence with larger scale planetary systems. And then learn to collaborate between bioregions to try to stabilize those planetary systems. Because the bioregional scale is not sufficient to do the planetary coupling, but it is a fundamental linkage of human scale integration. Humans can do regenerative work within the San Francisco Bay Area and maybe the drainage of the Sacramento River, to those of you who know California, which would be a scale of maybe a few hundred square miles or a few hundred square kilometers. And at that scale, you could try to create a regional economy. But then how does that relate to Humboldt County up north? How does that relate to Los Angeles to the south? How does that relate to Southern Oregon? How does that relate to the Colorado River or the Central Valley of California? And we start to see that there are these other larger patterns that are coupled, they are interdependent, but the scale of management is the bioregion. The scale of collaboration is the larger scale planetary processes, like say the weather patterns across Northern California, or the flow of water down the Colorado Basin, because it's Colorado's water that's pumped to the Central Valley of California, which then relates to something 1,000 miles away, closer to that front range of Colorado I mentioned where the Ute people used to be. And so we start to see that these planetary systems become design elements for the local landscapes, and the local landscapes become management units for the planetary systems. And then we have to go up and down in levels. So we don't just have one level. It's not like we focus on the bioregion and that's it. It's that we focus on the bioregion in partnership with other people focusing on bioregions. And it's that scale of bioregion plus bioregion to bioregion collaboration that enables us to go within the bioregion down to the scale of the regenerative farm, and from the bioregion up to the scale of the continent, or other things which we need to be able to do. And this starts to reveal that nothing like this has ever happened before in human history. Humans have never had this design challenge before. So we have to regenerate the entire Earth to stabilize our bioregions, but we do it by designing for our bioregions to be regenerative. And both of those, it's like a bidirectional causality, or in complexity science, the upward causation and the downward causation of the system. So I just said a bunch of stuff, which means I should stop there and pass it back for shaping again.
Thank you. Yeah. So a lot you shared there are things really important, I think, and you always sounds like start with this point that this is not a political movement. This is not a philosophy. This is grounded in science. This is a scientific framing of what are the natural segments or divisions that the Earth is comprised of. And, national borders are arbitrary, but the bioregional divisions are embedded. And so I think that first point is important. And I think there's something really beautiful about, although it is starting with this scientific framing and understanding of what a bioregion is, it's also not overly mechanistic or overly rigid, where it's like a set isolated thing. It's a bioregion will breathe, so to speak, that it changes as the tides come in and out. And so that one piece that offers or points to a malleability or a need for kind of constant awareness of the shifts in an ever-changing bioregion, but also that we can't separate that from the people and the organisms and animals that live there, and that it is tied as much to the community, which almost brings back in a necessary philosophy, but that's rooted in a scientific approach to understanding the challenge we're facing. And then I think equally important that every bioregion is unique, and has unique requirements and needs. And that was something you quoted someone else in another conversation, but one really important idea is that it's not that yes, we should be sharing knowledge and creating databases of best practices, but it's not like one solution from one place can be imported everywhere else. But the larger point is it's the capacities to affect regeneration that must be shared and that must be increased across all bioregions. As well, the point that bioregional thinking is not sufficient because a bioregion exists within a larger context and ultimately the planetary context. And I really love, I forget the exact wording, but that we can regenerate the earth only by focusing on our bioregions, but that, and that works both ways, but that bioregional focus has to be partnered with other bioregions, both those directly connected to us and those less obviously connected to us. So I would love to hear, unless there are other points you'd like to bring in, and then I see some folks started raising their hands. But I would love to hear how you see this network actualizing. I know you've just had a very exciting big launch. I don't know if you want to speak to now, but what do you see this? I mean, effectively, we're talking about not only a consciousness shift in our awareness that bioregions are the makeup of the earth in which we live, and that stewardship of those bioregions has to be our top priority if we are going to heal the earth and make it or get it back to a place or a state where it can sustain us all. So I'd love to hear how you envision this network working, looking like, and what, and then as well, what folks here can do to support that effort and your actualizing of this network specifically.
Yeah, let me start by saying I want to incorporate two questions that are in the chat, and I'm really interested in Steve bringing in his question in a moment. So Wendy asked if 70% of global populations are likely to be living in cities by 2050. How do we ensure that all the world's peoples are supported and treated equitably? And I would say ecologically speaking, that's a total pipe dream and a fantasy, because we've been ecological overshoot as a planet since the mid-1970s, and that the human population is only this large artificially by using up 200 million years of sunlight in the form of fossil fuels in the span of 200 years, and eating through the majority of the ecosystems of the planet. And so we're already in profound overshoot. So, so that's just a comment, which will start to lead into how we do this. And Benjamin Life had asked, I love to explore ecotones and the appropriate framing for defining the edges of bioregions nested and penetrating holons. And I think we can bring these two together and say that the idea for the Design School for Regenerating Earth, which we just launched a few weeks ago, and the previous work with Earth Regenerators that goes back about 3 years, has been exploring how to build the capacity to organize ourselves as landscapes and to do regenerative work in multi-level cooperative ways. But one of the things that's important is to know the reality of where we are. So the reality of where we are is that the human population is artificially large. It's been made large by using up fossil fuels and by depleting other the landscape complexity of the non-human environment, which is like 35% of the land surface of the earth on our continents has been converted from complex ecosystems into degraded landscapes in the form of agriculture and cities. And so that ecological overshoot is unavoidable. And the further we go into ecological overshoot, the more destruction occurs. And so one of the challenges becomes how to understand bioregionalism in a context of planetary overshoot. And then to understand that planetary overshoot has very serious implications for the maturity of the humans doing the work. Specifically, I mean the emotional, the psychological, the ethical capacities of the human beings doing this work. Because there are going to be very difficult choices to be made about human suffering and loss of life versus loss of non-human species with short-term and long-term consequences. And so those of us doing this work are going to have to live with incredible paradoxes and incredible difficulties in managing the complexity involved, which means we need really good social support systems for each other, those of us doing this work. We need to be able to have these conversations about the nuances and the complexity of colonialism, of intergenerational destruction, of ecocide, of what it really means to have biodiversity loss, of the fact that most people living in cities have basically zero eco-literacy and are pretty much just going to be very confused about the breakdown and collapse processes that are occurring because they're not connected to the systems of the earth that are breaking down. And so, and also there are time delays with various things like ocean acidification is causing all coral reefs on Earth to go away. And basically things happening now will ensure that coral won't even exist in the world ocean by around 2070 because coral will start to break down because of the acidity. Things that are in the time delays and the nestedness of the Earth system. And so when we start to try to define what is our bioregion and we try to explore how do we create bioregional regeneration in a context such as this, it's difficult to describe this work as being possible without some kind of spirituality, without some kind of exploration of deep sense of meaning and purpose, something larger than ourselves. Considering that, that it's hard to know what the carrying capacity is for humans on the Earth, but whatever it is, it's almost guaranteed to be less than 2 billion. And if it's less than 2 billion on a healthy planet, the further we degrade the planet, the more that level goes down. So what if the carrying capacity falls to 100,000 or to 10,000? Or what if we get to the point where humans are going extinct, like the black rhino that has living organisms but functionally can't reproduce itself, so it's functionally extinct and just waiting to go away? So you can see there are going to be very deep ethical and spiritual quandaries just because there's a possibility of this. Not because it's guaranteed, but because it's actually within the range of risk. Existential risk or human extinction is a possibility in the current context. It could really happen in the next 100 to 300 years. And we don't know because of the nonlinearities and the complexities of the systems we're dealing with. And so I would start by saying that the work of doing this bioregional regeneration requires us to understand how the planet creates homeostasis. Like, why was there a Holocene for the last 12,000 years? Why was there this warm, stable period in which all human societies, like city-states and empires and civilizations, every one of them existed in the last 12,000 years? Why is that? How did the planet do that? How did the human ability to be so adaptive to different contexts depend on the previous 2.5 million years of ice ages, causing relatively fast changes in ecosystems and the need for an adaptive learning species, like higher primates, like the great apes, like all of the humans? By the way, there's not just one human species. There have been many. Homo habilis, Neanderthals, Australopithecus boisei, etc. They're all humans. There were different human species. There's only one that remains now. And so I say all of this to say that the work of creating a planetary network of bioregional projects is to recognize that there are certain things that are actually not good design goals, like keeping the human population 3, 4, 5 times larger than the carrying capacity of the planet, while further degrading the planet's regenerative capacities, is actually not an effective goal, even though the grieving process that's involved in getting acceptance about that. So, break out your Joanna Macy, start doing your grieving work, because it's going to be so important to recognize how much death is inextricably part of the life process. How much death has already occurred and how much more death is going to occur. As Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, how much death had to occur to make the spring silent. And so this fixation on the loss of human life and this blindness to the loss of all of the rest of life on Earth, which is the only reason we're here, is the resilience of ecosystems, which requires biodiversity, is to not even know what it means to be human. Humans do not exist apart from the rest of the life systems of the planet. And so this becomes really deep, as you can see. It's not simply, how do we manage a landscape? How do we restore soils? We got to do stuff like that. But also, how do we bear witness to death? How do we hospice civilizations? How do we decide which species to try to save? I've got a friend named Connie Barlow. She is involved in something called assisted migration. She's a tree expert and a botanist. She takes trees from California to British Columbia because they can't walk fast enough for climate change. Those trees will go extinct if she doesn't move them 1,000 miles north. And so that's a spiritual practice to choose which trees to save. And so it's at this depth we have to be thinking about bioregional regeneration. Now, the technological parts, the management parts, the economic parts, they have to be solid too. We have to have really good thinking about those parts. But if we don't get the spiritual part right, what's all this for? What's the purpose? How do I find meaning? Then we're going to be very confused as these ongoing collapse processes continue intensifying because they're real, whether we're in denial about them or not. And so just recognizing how complex all of that is. So I wanted to name that to say part of how we define our bioregions is going to be around our sense of purpose. Where I live in Barichara, Colombia, we have a particular ecosystem called the High Andes Tropical Dry Forest. It exists nowhere else on Earth. 8 out of 10 species are endemic. They live nowhere else on Earth. And it's 95% deforested and becoming a desert. So I have chosen to try to save the biodiversity of the High Andes Tropical Dry Forest. So part of my definition of the bioregion is going to be my sense of purpose. I'm trying to save this ecotype. So that starts to get at Benjamin's question from the chat. How do we define ecotone and culture? Part of it is our sense of purpose. I want to build cultural identity around the High Andes Tropical Dry Forest with the other people who love it here where I live in Colombia. And so we can blend ecological necessity with cultural identity through purpose, through our sense of purpose. Like, what would it mean to restore the Amazon? Well, that's an identity, right? Dan, I know, is here on the call, and he's done a lot of work in the Amazon, and the Amazon is like 200 rivers. So how do you define your identity and your purpose? Which level? And so just recognizing how agile that part is for us to define in different ways. And I know I've left Steve sitting, but I might have shifted so far that we have moved away from what you want to talk about. But I'd love to invite you to chat. Come on in.
Yeah, no, thank you. I just want to amplify and first of all, just deep gratitude for all that you're doing and all that you're bringing. What an additional inspiration of your work for me that I haven't heard emphasized here that I just wanted to sort of call out is you've done a great job of, bioregionalism as praxis, right? And grounding it in geographic reality and ecological reality as opposed to just philosophical opinions or political disputes. And yet there still can be disagreements about that praxis. And so what element that you also bring in is this notion of regenerating Earth as a goal, as a bold endeavor that can bind and unify these efforts, right? So then it provides a framework where we don't have to talk about whether you're doing bioregionalism right or not, because it gives the larger context to sort of ground it in, well, what's been the results and how do we relate to one another? And so it's that notion of a shared bold endeavor that I just find singular and inspiring, and it begs a whole bunch of questions about, well, how do we organize then to accomplish that shared goal? It's like it's the Gaia bioregion, right? that is unifying this, and the fact that we've already experienced the biodiversity loss, we've already experienced the topsoil degradation, we've already experienced the ocean acidification. These are not future eventualities that are some off in some distant future. They're actually past realities that we need to come to grips with. And so literally the task of how do we regenerate the damage we've already done becomes a very concrete goal, and one that I find is hugely unifying. So I just wanted to call that out.
Yeah, let me first name, which I think you're already familiar with, the biggest contention in the bioregionalism movement is how to define a bioregion. It's just a lot, been so many arguments, but you know what? Politics should be about deciding the identity of the culture. the culture should decide, and that is a big part of politics. So that contention is welcome. Bring it. It's so important. Let's not bypass it. It's really important. And the other thing that I wanted to name with respect to what you just said about that bold endeavor is the most important thing to regenerate. And I'm going to celebrate my friend Felipe Medina, who I live with here in Barichara, because he works with kids, and the kids are leading the regeneration effort. They're trying to restore the quebrada, which is the watershed for a river that has dried up here. And it's led by children between the age of 2 and 10. Little kids are leading the effort. And what Felipe noticed was that the most important thing to regenerate is our ability to imagine. Our ability to imagine, which is this profound thing. Say, how could we imagine living differently? And so that shifting baseline, that thing that what is normal to you is what you were born with. So if you were born into a degraded landscape, like if you were in the Scottish Highlands with their beautiful meadows and their beautiful little patches of forest, which are degraded landscapes. You know, they're like after a couple thousand years of agriculture, those are degraded landscapes. But that's your idyllic callback to health, is the way it was when you were a child. That this ability to imagine beyond what we've experienced ourselves. This also is a benefit of bioregional exchange. And I'll give a really concrete example. Back in 2019, I was living in Costa Rica, and I gave a workshop called Managing Planetary Collapse. It was a 5-day workshop. People from around the world came to it. And one of the things we did on day 3 of this 5-day workshop was we hiked up into a part of the cloud forest where there was a food forest project, and we had lunch up there with the people that manage the food forest. And as we went up into a biodiversity hotspot in northern Costa Rica, the people who came to this workshop broke down and cried because they had no idea what biodiversity really is. They had no idea. They didn't know what it's like to be in a forest with 800 bird species and 20,000 species of insects. They had no idea. Now, those of us who have been to a tropical rainforest, just think about how much that changes you forever once you've experienced that. Like your idea of what biodiversity is completely shifted. So this shifting baseline problem has a partial solution, which is visit a biodiversity place that is higher than where you've ever been. And then you start to be able to imagine more biodiversity than your landscape already has. And so this is one of those things about bioregional exchanges, is that we need the earth to teach us through the beauty and the majesty and the awe, the revelry of her landscapes, which is why going into that cloud forest in the Monteverde area near Lake Arenal in northern Costa Rica was like spiritually transformative. It was a cathartic moment of transformation for people to realize how far they had fallen from healthy biodiversity, because they saw some of the most extreme positive biodiversity on Earth. Like Osa Peninsula in Costa Rica is the most biodiverse place on Earth, 2.4% of the world's biodiversity in a little like 20 by 40 kilometer square rectangle. It's like this little place, the most biodiverse place on Earth. To go to a place like that is to adjust your expectations about what's possible and open up an imaginative realm for regeneration that is beyond comprehension before having that experience. So this piece of it, this piece of realizing we can think like the Earth, because we have things like really advanced high performance computing with really good Earth observing data from satellites and monitoring systems and really good scientific visualization. This morning I was watching some NASA videos. Damn, they're good. Like they're really good. This 5-minute video about the ocean circulation and how it relates to the weather. And like, God, they're beautiful. And you can imagine the Earth with these powerful, like augmented perception tools, high performance computing, data analysis, sensor monitoring networks with scientific visualization and Hollywood quality storytelling. That's called NASA. That's what NASA is. It's not just a scientist, it's not a scientific organization, it's a storytelling organization. But it's a storytelling organization about the Earth. That's why everyone loves NASA. And so like to recognize that we can see the Earth in profoundly different ways because of these tools. My entryway into Earth system science was satellite remote sensing, which means I spent every day looking at the Earth from space through satellite data. I was studying clouds. You know what happens when you study clouds with satellite data? It's like studying paintings with Picasso. You fall in love with the art. So if you fall in love with the paintings, here you fall in love with the Earth as art. And so like these capacities are profound to open up our imagination. And so step one of the regenerative process becomes connect to yourself and heal enough to open your imagination just a little bit. Just a little bit. And then find the others who are doing it and connect around the landscapes you love. And you are beginning a process of bioregionalism just with that. So yeah, so much more to say, as you can imagine. We're just like touching 1,000 topics here. But it's so important to see that it really is possible to see and think like the Earth because of Earth system science and because of things like NASA or the European Space Agency or the World Wildlife Fund and just on and on. You know, like Humboldt Institute, which is here in Colombia, which oversees a lot of biological conservation projects in Central and South America. You know, the biosphere reserves of Central America, like on and on and on. We have this data and cooperation and storytelling. What we don't have is the design pathway, which, by the way, for those of you who care, I don't normally promote my book, but my book is called The Design Pathway for Regenerating Earth, which is we organize ourselves as landscapes, collaborate across landscapes, understanding the whole Earth. And this is actually possible to do, but only in the last 30 years has it been possible to do. The first operational satellites were put in space in 1971. The first humans to go into space were in the 1950s. And so like the ability to do all of this emerged just when we need it. And so just to recognize the synchronicity of Gaia in making it possible for humans to reintegrate with the Earth at a planetary scale, just as we might go away. And that's the depth of the work before us.
There are a lot of, I mean, there was a lot there between your response to Steve and the point he brought in to, yeah, this idea. I mean, a few important things to touch on are how, yes, this can be a unifying force, how not just education, but early childhood education being integrated, and not just in some ephemeral way where we're telling kids, oh, the world's in a bad state, so you got to recycle, but actually having children walk the land. And then in another video you spoke to having the kids, 5-year-olds, go and interview landowners and ask what happened to the waterways. And you know how that is itself a spiritual experience, to be challenged by a child. What have you done with the water? Kind of elevates our consciousness, and we talk about it being a spiritual experience, and that being a unifying experience. Before coming to the particular place I'm now, I was in Diamante Luz, a regenerative community that is being stewarded by the community, but Danielle Kennedy, Danny Bell, who's on the call, who's actually here with us running the event that I'm at, getting to sit in and watch her actualize what you're talking about, which, you know, what is this community building? Is it some like thing that you can put in a systems manual and then just franchise? It's like, it was talking, you know, sitting down with people one-to-one or in groups and talking to them and finding out what they need, and what is stopping, say, the mothers in the village from participating in the governance. Well, they need childcare, and so coordinating childcare so that the mothers can not only help participate in sorting out the crop yields, but then actually participate in the governance, and seeing the community in action has itself been a spiritual. There she is. Has itself been a spiritual experience, and I think, you know, we often think of even the term spiritual experience as some like isolated inner work that you're doing on some mountain while meditating and not talking to anyone, but it's building relationships and touching the soil and listening to those in your community as to what they need and trying to work with them to help foster that. And then on top of it, and this is what we were saying earlier as to the power of this bioregionalism for being a real, truly ubiquitous, completely unifying force, because no matter where we are in place. And this need for us to return to caring for the earth doesn't start, and I kind of love that it doesn't start as a political effort or a spiritual effort. It starts in science, but it inevitably leads to something that touches the personal, the communal, the spiritual, and inevitably the political. I want to honor your time. I know we're a little over the hour, and we were scheduled to go just till 1. So I want to invite any final reflections you have, and then for everyone else in the room, we'll jump into our impact speed dating the next 45 minutes before we get into our Society West session, which very much that quote, that thing you said that I wrote down in the chat. The most important thing is to regenerate our ability to imagine. Yes, +1.
Yeah, I want to maybe say something that I've said in other contexts that just seems really important, which is that we move at the speed of trust. I don't know if I've heard someone else say that or I picked it up myself. It just, I feel like I've always known it, even though I know that's not true. But I definitely, doing the work, and I see, is it Danielle or Danny, however you pronounce your name? I'm sure I can see you nodding like, yeah, we go at the speed of trust. When trust breaks down, all hell breaks loose. It's such a big deal. And also that when we coalesce after or during a conflict, the trust that is present enables the forward motion and healing. And so I just wanted to name this piece because where I live, just to give you a really like a vivid sense of it. So I live in Barichara, Colombia, which is where the Northern Andes do this. They're sort of going north and they make a sharp turn to the left toward Panama, right in that turn. And this is a place where the independence movement against the Spanish crown started. And this is the place where the free thinking movement against Catholic indoctrination in schools started. And this is the place on 3 different occasions in Colombia's history was the most violent place in Colombia during each of those times. There was a period for about 40 years in the last century, between about the 1960s and 1990s, when Barichara was the most violent place in Colombia. Right now, it's an island of peace and stability. And so the paradox is that the trust that emerges in a place like this only happens when we remember and we reconstruct the history of what came before, where we understand what we're arriving into. And so I've been accused of satanic rituals, of child prostitution rings, all kinds of weird stuff by local people, because it's not about me. They just accuse anyone. They just project this onto anyone who's an outsider. And I didn't know this at first. And it's because I'm in a clan-based xenophobic culture with a long, long history of violence that repeats in waves over the span of 500 years. And the indigenous people were successfully, the genocide was completed in the 1730s. So while there are some indigenous people here from this place, their culture is in tatters, their language is gone, like they were effectively genocided. And so to come to a place like this, as a person with this color skin, by the way, you might notice I'm a bit pink for a white guy. So let's just recognize how racial categories don't capture the reality, but the local people think of me as a white guy from the north. So I have to be really mindful about what projections are going to come from that as I enter a place like this, so that the trust that is able to grow is real and lasting. And so to just show that the ability to build trust and to move at the speed of trust is to recognize when you focus on building trust and when trust enables you to move. When the work is building trust and when the work is to lean on trust to do something else. But you're not doing the work without trust. That I can guarantee you from a simple, practical point of view, that something will be an obstacle. Someone will be an obstacle. if you don't have trust. And so this ability to create cooperative groups becomes a major focus, just something we didn't really talk about in the last hour, but I wanted to close in naming it and saying that not only do we regenerate our capacity to imagine, we have to regenerate our capacity to cooperate. And this requires working together with other people who may not look like us, who may not talk like us, who may not sound like us, who may piss us off. But you know what? The work is too important. And so, so I wanted to maybe end with that to say that we can do the full range, all the way up to the planetary scale, immense complexity, all the way to the most internal, intimate, personal, spiritual crisis, relationship conflicts and dynamics, grieving and trauma. It's all there. It's all there, and it's all part of this work. And that doesn't overwhelm us when the work is located in place. When we're located in place, the context tells us what to do. The land teaches us how to do it. The local people tell us what we can and cannot do because they will or won't support it. And so this ability to work within a context, that context holds a lot of the complexity. So while this might feel overwhelming, any of you who are doing this work in real world communities at community scale, you know that the complexity is processed as a community dynamic in one form or another, whether it's market signaling or healing ritual circles or plant medicine or whatever it is, there are ways of holding the complexity in the context. And so, but we have to be able to sit with the complexity at the same time. So I'm gonna stop here by just saying, I hope I've been a good provocateur. I hope I've given you a lot to think about and a lot to talk about. And I hope we can all collaborate together in creating a planetary network of bioregional regeneration efforts. I hope so, because I'm pretty sure, based on my scientific understanding of the Earth, that that's the only way we can do it. And so I'm not convinced, metaphysically or ideologically, but I am pretty compelled by the evidence that this is the only way we can do it. And so I just want to say thank you, Elliot, for inviting me. Thank you to all my friends who are here, old and new. And I look forward to playing more in the future. Come join us at the Design School for Regenerating Earth if you want. Elliot dropped that in the chat. But, find us on Twitter, everywhere. Elliot and I are in contact. Dan and I are in contact. Benjamin Leifer and I, there are a lot of us here. Darren Zoll's playing with us. There are a lot of us. If you're playing with any of them, you're playing with us too. So with that, onward, fellow humans. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Joe. So I'll give him some love. Thank you.